Hello, everyone. I'm Alla Marchenko, president of the Aurora Philosophy Institute. Our speaker this evening is Professor Graham Hubbs, formerly chair of philosophy at the University of Idaho, who will be presenting the topic G.E.M. Anscombe's Moral Philosophy. Gertrude Elizabeth Margaret Anscombe was professor of philosophy at the University of Cambridge and is regarded as one of the leading women philosophers of the 20th century. She was a close associate of Ludwig Wittgenstein and was a translator of philosophical investigations. If you're watching on our API YouTube channel, please subscribe, join the comment section, and press the like button. And if you really like it, I should mention that on the channel and on the API website, there is a voluntary donate button. Any contributions, no matter how big or small, will be greatly appreciated. Welcome, Graham.
Well, thanks for having me. We're going to discuss Anscombe's moral philosophy tonight. And in particular, we're going to look at her seminal essay, Modern Moral Philosophy, and focus on a couple of the theses that she advances there. So that'll be our agenda for the night. First, a little bit of biography on Anscombe that Alla already gave us, so some of this will be slightly redundant. Anscombe, I'm going to move you all out of the way. Anscombe was born in Limerick, Ireland in, there we go, sorry about that, 18 March 1919, so we just went past her birthday. Oops, there we go. She left Ireland and entered Oxford as a student at St. Hugh's College in 1938. She was a Catholic, but she converted to Catholicism. She began studying Catholicism immediately upon arriving at Oxford and converted shortly thereafter. We'll be talking a little bit about her Catholicism over the course of our discussion tonight. She left Oxford in 1938. Moved to Cambridge in 1942, where, as mentioned earlier, she met Ludwig Wittgenstein and moved back to Oxford in 1946. She left such an impression on Wittgenstein that she was the only English speaker that he authorized to translate his works after meeting her, and so she translated the definitive version of the Philosophical Investigations. So she spends the majority of her career in Oxford, but then returns to Cambridge in 1970, where she retired. And she took the chair that Wittgenstein had held when she goes back to Cambridge, and then died in January of 2001. All right, so the essay that we're talking about tonight, Modern Moral Philosophy, was published in the journal Philosophy in 1958. And I'll read the opening paragraph because she states right up front clearly what the objective of this essay, which runs 19 pages in the journal, is to be. She says, I will begin by stating three theses which I present in this paper. The first is that it is not profitable for us at present to do moral philosophy. That should be laid aside at any rate until we have an adequate philosophy of psychology, in which we are conspicuously lacking. The second is that the concepts of obligation and duty, moral obligation and moral duty, that is to say, and of what is morally right and wrong, and of the moral sense of ought to be jettisoned if this is psychologically possible, because they are survivals or derivatives from survivals from an earlier conception of ethics, which no longer generally survives and are only harmful without it. My third thesis is that the differences between the well-known English writers on moral philosophy from Sidgwick to the present day are of little importance. Okay. Today, I'm going to focus on the second and third theses that she introduces here at the outset of modern moral philosophy. The first thesis concerning the need for an adequate philosophy of psychology is something that I covered in my previous lecture on Anscombe that I gave to the API a couple of years ago, which you can find on the YouTube channel. That is the lecture on her work Intention, which is it's a long essay or a short book, depending on how you look at it, where she begins to sketch what she thinks that adequate philosophy of psychology is. So if you're interested in that, you can go have a look at that lecture on the API's YouTube page. Today, though, we'll be focusing on the second and third of her theses, which I'm going to rephrase slightly here. First, moral philosophers ought to stop talking about the moral sense of ought. So I'll be going over that first. And then we will look at her claim that most English language moral philosophy since the 1870s is basically the same. In the context of discussing that claim and arguing for it, she coins a phrase that has been with us forever since, namely, or a term that has been with us forever since, namely the term consequentialism. So we'll get to that and what she has to say about consequentialism and how it unites all of the British moral thinkers of her day going back 70 or 80 years in due time. Okay, so let's start with thesis 2, which is her critique of the moral sense of ought. And to get into this, let's talk about different senses that the term ought has. And here I've got up the cover of a book by my colleague and friend, Matthew Chrisman, who back in 2008, I think it was, or 2010, so about a decade ago, wrote a book called The Meaning of Ought that goes through and gives us semantics for all the varieties of things one can mean in English with the word ought. And Matthew helpfully in that book lays out some different, what he calls flavors of the term ought that will allow us to see the various ways that we use the term in our speech. Sometimes we use the term ought in an epistemic way to state an expectation of something that is going to happen. For example, if I say, the package ought to arrive tomorrow, I'm telling you that I expect for it to arrive tomorrow. That's an expression of a belief that I have about how the world is going to turn out tomorrow. This is just can be distinguished from what we can call the teleological conception of ought. Teleology means goal-directed, and so the teleological flavor of ought describes something as good or essential for some completable goal. So I might say, you ought to use Genovese basil if you want to make an authentic pesto. In contrast with the previous flavor of ought, I'm not making any sort of prediction about the way the world is going to be. I'm not expressing an expectation for the way it's going to be. Instead, I'm explaining that if you have a certain goal, then an appropriate or good means towards achieving that goal is to do the thing in question, namely get the right kind of basil if you want to make authentic pesto. Another flavor of ought is the prudential flavor of ought. It's like the teleological flavor of ought in that it directs action, but instead of directing action at a completable goal, it directs action through describing something as good or essential for producing a good ongoing state. So if I say you ought to quit smoking, part of what I'm doing there is alluding to the fact that what it is to be a good human is to be a healthy human, and that smoking is not a part of a healthy life. So it's, again, similar to the teleological flavor of ought in that it's aiming at something and directing action in a certain way, but instead of directing it at a completable goal, it's directing action at if the agent succeeds and stops smoking, gets to be healthy at an ongoing state. That subtle difference is not going to be as significant to us, but it's yet another flavor that, that Matthew talks about in his book. Finally, we get the sense that is Anscombe's concern, which is the moral sense of ought. And this describes something as morally good or essential. For example, you ought to tell the truth and to help those in need is something that one might say as a moral precept. Okay, now, I just presented the moral ought as describing something as morally good or essential. And there's my example sentence again. But this is obviously a circular definition. It uses the term moral in defining what the term moral is supposed to be. Circular definitions are famously unhelpful. And if we're trying to learn about what a concept is, we don't know what it is in advance, or we have some confusion about it in advance. So what can we do to clear up this circularity and improve upon our definition? We'll bring Anscombe into the picture here and think about what her analysis of the moral flavor of ought is. And she says that when we use the term ought and say that we're using it in its moral register and not say it's epistemological register or it's merely teleological register, what it intends to convey is the idea of some kind of obligation. So if we morally ought to do something, then what we're saying is that we are obliged to do that thing. And it's a distinctive kind of obligation that we mean to flag when we use the term moral and talk about what we morally ought to do. It's different from, say, a legal obligation or a contractual obligation. I might think that or might know for that matter, that I'm legally obliged to do something, but it might be something that I think is evil or unvirtuous. And I might say, well, I legally ought to do whatever this thing is, but morally I ought not to do it. So when we use the term moral in connection with this ought, it is distinguishable from these other kinds of obligation that we might have. Okay, so having homed in on that in her essay, Anscombe then says, what is the source of these special obligations that generate this particular flavor of the term ought? Where do these obligations come from? Legal obligations come from the law. Contractual obligations come from undertaking some kind of contract. If there's this special kind of obligation, it's moral obligations, it's got to come from somewhere. Where does it come from? Now, as a backdrop, Anscombe seems to think that obligations in general are either generated by agreements, and contracts would be a species of these agreements, or by commands. If someone has an authority over me, they might generate an obligation for me by saying that I ought to do something. So there's two general different ways in which we find ourselves saddled with obligations of the world, either through our own consent to those with whom we're equal in the relevant sense, or by having obligations placed on us by those who have an appropriate kind of control over us. Codes and systems of morality present moral obligations not as the product of agreements, but as rules and laws. So if we're going to be thinking about where moral obligations come from, our focus is going to be on the latter kind of obligation generation and not the former. Even in social contract theories, which do try to build an account out of standing social obligations, out of the idea that we engage in agreements and contracts with one another. Even theories of this sort have to answer the question, why do we keep our promises? And inevitably, they turn into some story about following a kind of law. So we will do well then to limit our focus on obligations that are generated by somebody or something that has the authority to produce them over us. All right, so if the moral obligations are produced or have the form of some kind of law, but it's a special kind of law, not secular law that the governments that we happen to live under create, but a different, higher kind of law, where do these laws come from? The ones that bind us in this special way that, again, can be at odds with the state's laws or with the terms of a contract. And Anscombe notes that if you're a member of an Abrahamic religion, that is of Christianity, she focuses just on Judaism and Christianity, but the point would hold just as well of Islam. Well, the answer is easy as to where these special obligations come from. They come from God. God tells you what you should or shouldn't do. The paradigm for this in the Old Testament is the 10 Commandments, a bunch of laws saying what thou shalt not do. So if you're a member of one of these religions, then the answer is pretty easy as to what the source of these obligations are. And again, Anscombe herself is Catholic, which there's an irony of which she must be self-aware in the way that she argues throughout this essay, because this is a spot where if you didn't know she was Catholic and read the conclusions that she came to, you might be quite surprised to learn, because she knows that most of her contemporaries in Oxford and Cambridge, not only are they not Catholic, they're not Christian at all, and so are trying to provide an atheist secular ethics. So if you're an atheist, you don't believe in Anscombe's Catholic God, then where do these special obligations come from? Anscombe's answer to this is that for atheists who recognize no divine lawgiver, saying someone morally ought to do something is an empty or meaningless thing to say. So remember that her thesis about moral, the moral term of ought, the moral flavor of ought rather, is that it should be jettisoned from the mouths of moral philosophers. And we've just got the outline of the argument why. In order for the term to mean anything, it needs to, it presupposes the existence of a being that these atheists do not believe in. So here's her text where she makes that claim in her own words. To have a law conception of ethics is to hold that what is needed for conformity with the virtues, failure in which the mark of being a bad qua man and not just merely qua craftsman or logician, that what is needed for this is required by divine law. Naturally, it is not possible to have such a conception unless you believe in a God as a lawgiver, like Jews, Stoics, and Christians. But if such a conception is dominant for many centuries and then is given up, it is a natural result that the concept of obligation or being bound or required by law should remain, though they had lost their root. And if the word ought has become invested in certain context with the sense of obligation, it too will remain to be spoken with a special emphasis and a special feeling in these contexts. But this is a mistake. Going on speaking this way with this special feeling, although the root has been removed, it is a mistake. It's a mistake like the following. It is as if the notion criminal were to remain when criminal law and criminal courts had been abolished and forgotten. A David Hume discovering the situation might conclude that there was a special sentiment expressed by criminal, which alone gave the word its sense. So Hume discovered the situation in which the notion obligation survived, and the notion ought was invested with that peculiar force, having which it is said to be used in a moral sense, but in which the belief in divine law had long since abandoned, for it was substantially given up amongst Protestants in the time of the Reformation. And here's her summary on what's going on when her contemporaries speak of the moral ought. The situation, if I am right, was the interesting one of the survival of a concept outside the framework of thought that made it a really intelligible one. So, according to this argument, we've lost that framework. The concept is no longer intelligible. And so we should stop talking about the moral sense of ought, its corresponding notions of moral duty, moral right and wrong, etc. Again, learning that it is a Catholic and a devout Catholic who is making these claims can be quite striking, because this sounds like an intense form of relativism of the likes that one might find in someone like Friedrich Nietzsche. And indeed, Nietzsche makes an argument extremely similar to this in the Genealogy of Morals. There's good reason to think that the argument in both cases ultimately traces back to Schopenhauer, but a Catholic philosopher is perhaps on the face of it, the last one that one would expect to be making such a claim. Okay, let's press on then to the next of her theses that she wants to argue for in this essay, and that is that most English language moral philosophy since the 1970s is basically all the same. That there's a lot of internecine quibbling between moral philosophers at Oxford and at Cambridge. But for as different as they take their views to be, Anscombe thinks that in the big picture, broadly, they all are committed to some common agreements that make them much more similar to one another than they understand. And that agreement is that they are all consequentialists, even though they don't know it because she hasn't invented the term and the category consequentialism yet for people to think about themselves under. Now, the reason that she cares about this, other than for her purely philosophical concerns to scold the shallow-minded and make them realize what lies behind their views, the reason that she cares about this as an individual, as a person engaged in the events of her day, is that consequentialism doesn't have the resources to express the doctrine of double effect. And now, why does that matter? That matters because it is what one needs if one wants to criticize the decisions of Harry Truman to drop the bomb on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which she herself is concerned about. That's perhaps too strong. There might be other ways of critiquing Truman for this decision. But she thinks that contemporary philosophy has lost a grip on the doctrine of double effect, and that recovering it will allow us to see some things about Truman that her contemporaries at Oxford refused to see or were blinded from seeing. In 1956, Oxford proposed to give Truman an honorary degree. So this is just 11 years after the dropping of the bombs. Anscombe and some of her colleagues were furious about this because, as far as she was concerned, Truman was a mass murderer for dropping the bombs on the citizens of those two cities. And here, I think, we can see a spot where her Catholic background does matter, because, as I was just noting, her opposition to Truman and her argument against Truman is driven by her embrace of the doctrine of double effect. Okay, so what is the doctrine of double effect? Well, the doctrine of double effect states that if Truman intentionally did something morally permissible, for example, sending troops into Japan, and Anscombe is not a pacifist. In her essays on this issue, she rails against pacifism and thinks that the very idea of pacifism is partially to blame for the disappearance of the understanding of the doctrine of double effect. So she does think that there's such a thing as just war. And if Truman, and Truman made all sorts of orders that were part of a war that would be compatible with just war theory. So if Truman intentionally does something morally permissible, and if this predictably leads to something impermissible, such as innocent civilians getting killed, then the action might be permissible. So the doctrine of double effect states that we can separate out the intention of an action from the predictable consequences of an action, and that the primary source of responsibility for the action lies in the intention, even if there's some predictably bad stuff that's going to happen as a result of following the intention. Anscombe thought, however, that that is not what Truman did when he dropped the bombs. Instead, he intentionally killed tens of thousands of innocent civilians. There's no gap between the predictable consequences and what he intentionally did. And that, she thinks, is murder. And so, following up on that, she thinks that it's inappropriate to be giving honorary degrees to people for having committed not just any murder, but mass murder. Okay, so how does Anscombe arrive at this conclusion? Well, one of the key points, one of the key moves for arriving at that conclusion is a specific definition of intentional action, and a definition of intentional action that distinguishes intentions from predictions about what the effects of one's behavior are going to be. So in her book Intention, which again I cover in the other API lecture that I've given on Anscombe, she defines human intentional action as human activity that has the teleological order of practical reasoning. That is, the order of reasoning that takes a goal and then reasons about the means of achieving that goal and then settles upon some means in order to achieve that goal. So teleological just means means ends, goal-directed reasoning. And she asks, when Truman dropped the bombs, was the killing of innocent civilians a predictable side effect of the action, or was it the means towards the desired end, namely terrifying the population into submission and thereby making the Japanese surrender? And Anscombe says it was the latter. It was the means to the end. It was not the same thing as dropping a bomb on a munitions plant when you know that there are civilians nearby who are likely going to die as a result of the dropping of the bomb. That kind of unfortunate side effect from the dropping of the bomb is distinguishable logically from the means taken from killing people as a means in order to achieve some kind of objective in the war. So she argues it was intentional because it belonged to the overarching logic of the action, the overarching means and logic of the action. Then by definition, it's murder. She just thinks that murder just is the innocent killing of innocents, either as a means towards some other good, or perhaps the killing of innocents for the sake of killing the innocents. That too would be murder. But she's only interested in this kind of action as it's a means towards something else. And so that's her argument against Truman. Now, a natural rejoinder, which she anticipates and she knows that her contemporaries have in mind as well, is, but what about the possibility that if Truman had not dropped the bomb, millions and millions of more would have died? What kind of, what does Anscombe have to say about that as a rejoinder to her complaints about Truman's action having satisfied the definition of murder because of its particular teleological structure? So this is where, with all that as the setup, we arrive at her complaint, which is the third thesis of modern moral philosophy. Basically, all British moral philosophy for the past 70 years is the same. But more people would have died otherwise argument is an example of a consequentialist argument. And as I noted beforehand, she invents the term consequentialism in this essay in order to discuss the style of argument and the philosophy that lies behind making this kind of point. Why is it a consequentialist argument? Oh, I'll go ahead and tell you this right now. It's a consequentialist argument because it says when we're trying to determine, and let's just do the Truman case, whether or not it was morally correct or morally permissible even for Truman to have dropped the bomb, what we do is we think about the consequences of that action, and then we compare it to the consequences of Truman not having dropped the bomb, and we perform some kind of calculus, some sort of analysis that weighs up the benefits and weighs up the costs and compares them to one another. And if it turns out that the benefits of dropping the bomb, let's say the saving of millions of lives that otherwise would have died, outweighs the total number of lives that were lost by the dropping of the bombs, then that's the right thing to do. We're looking just at the consequences of the action, and that's it. Okay. Again, she says that what unites English moral philosophers since Sidgwick is that they are all consequentialists. She provides evidence of this over the course of her essay. Now, she adds that it is a necessary feature of consequentialism that it is a shallow philosophy. So what exactly is the problem? Let me pause for a second to flag something that about the way that I've presented this that may be slightly confusing. I want to undo some confusion I might have generated here at the outset before proceeding on. In Modern Moral Philosophy, the essay that I'm wanting us to focus on here today, she doesn't say anything at all about Truman. She doesn't say anything at all about the bomb. She explicitly addresses Truman and the bomb in a pamphlet that she circulated at Oxford upon his being given the honorary degree. She had an essay that she wrote in a Catholic journal about just war theory that was related to thinking through these issues with Truman. But in Modern Moral Philosophy, she is trying to step back and abstract away from these immediate live concerns about Truman that are pressing to her as an individual citizen. She's trying to step back and just look at the philosophical landscape as it exists in Oxford, in Cambridge, in her day, and say, what is it about moral philosophers in England these days that creates an argumentative space in which it is so much as intelligible to think that we should reward people who commit acts that, when thought of from a different moral perspective, would be vicious, but not the kind of thing that we would want to applaud. So she's trying to step back and do the general philosophical work, although her, like, at the core of her being, real live political concerns have to do with Truman himself. So we'll leave Truman aside now and just focus on the broad general arguments that she provides in Modern Moral Philosophy on this topic. All right, so what is it about consequentialism that makes it, from her point of view, such a shallow philosophy? Why is it problematic as an approach to doing ethics? So she says the first thing to note about consequentialist thinkers is that, and the consequentialist approach to doing moral philosophy, the first thing to note is that according to the consequentialist, responsibility for an action primarily lies in the agent's estimation of the expected consequences of what they do. In many cases, it's inappropriate to hold somebody unaccountable for accidental consequences that they did not anticipate. If you're following the laws and driving down the road and you don't anticipate hitting an ice slick or an oil slick on the road, you're doing everything that you could to drive well, you accidentally hit it, you skid off, and then you hit somebody. If it was a total accident, you weren't being negligent at all, you were following the laws, there seems like something remiss about holding you morally accountable for, I just committed Anscombe's mistake, ethically accountable for, I committed the mistake that Anscombe wants to disabuse of the way that I just used the word moral. You shouldn't be held accountable for that in the same way as if you deliberately try to knock out the person who's driving down the side of the road. So if it's strictly an accident that you hit the person, the accountability, it seems on just about any view, is not the same as if you deliberately target the person while you're driving the car. So if we're thinking about that generally accepted fact about ethics within a consequentialist framework, we're going to want to distinguish between predictable consequences of an action and unpredictable consequences of an action. To be sure, in some cases, a person might be accountable because they should have expected the consequences that they simply didn't consider. That there's room for being negligent about things that you ought to have considered. But even here, the responsibility stems from their lack of consideration and not having expected it, and not just the consequences of the act itself. So on this view, ethical responsibility is going to stem from the expectations of the agent about what's going to happen as a result of doing something, and both what they actually do expect and what they ought to have expected, because it's what any rational person would have expected to come about. Okay, so that's the first thing that we note about consequentialist theories of ethics, is that they locate responsibility for action primarily in the expected consequences that an agent has of what's going to happen from what they do. Now, the next thing to note is that if only expected consequences matter for the ethical assessment of an action, then there's no kind of action that is intrinsically bad just as a function of the type of action it is. So suppose that we've got a character here, we'll call him Jack. And if you deliberately kill Jack and harvest his organs, it's going to save the lives of 5 others. Do all the stuff in the thought experiment that you need to make it clear. You're at the hospital. You've got a team ready to harvest the organs very quickly. You've got patients who need kidneys and livers just waiting there. Make Jack and the other 5 people all of the same age, make them of the same intellectual capacities, make them in every respect that you can think of, make them all equally deserving of living. And now with all that set up in your thought experiment, imagine that if you go ahead and kill Jack, the 5 people that are standing there waiting for, they're probably lying down, waiting for kidneys and hearts and the like are going to survive. And if you don't kill Jack, the other 5 are going to die. According to consequentialism, not only is it permissible that you kill Jack, you're required to kill Jack. It's the only good thing to do. It's the action that it guides you to do is to maximize benefits through your activity. And here we've got a situation where 5 people are going to live if you kill Jack, but only 1 person, Jack, is going to live if you refuse to do so. And when you do the calculus, sure seems like if that's all that you were considering, then again, not only is it permissible, but it's required that you kill Jack so that the other people can live. This is a variant thought experiment of something that many of you may be familiar with, which is the trolley problem, which is a reaction in the middle part of the 20th century to thinking through the predominance of consequentialism, after Anscombe has named it, in thinking about ethics in English-speaking philosophy. So that's one thing about action guidance. If we're thinking now about the role of theories of ethics, not in helping us figure out what to do, but in helping us figure out how to evaluate the goodness or badness and the responsibility of actions after they've taken place, then the only thing that someone who comes along and evaluates your behavior should do after you've killed Jack or failed to kill Jack is, what did you expect to happen as a result of the consequences? This goes back to the previous slide. That's the metric standard that we use for evaluating the goodness or badness of your action. Oops, lost it. Okay, oops. So the third thing to note, Anscombe thinks about consequentialism, after we've noted these 2 points about what makes a consequentialist view what it is that Western moral systems from the Greeks to the Abrahamic religions do not agree with consequentialism on these 2 points. Here's Anscombe's own words on it. This is a significant thing. It means that all these philosophies, all these consequentialist philosophies in British moral philosophy from 1870 on, all of them are quite incompatible with the Hebrew Christian ethic. And she adds Greek to this as well. For it has been characteristic of that ethic to teach that there are certain things forbidden whatever consequences threaten, such as choosing to kill the innocent for any purpose, however good, vicarious punishment, treachery, by which I mean obtaining a man's confidence in a grave matter by promises of trustworthy friendship and then betraying him to his enemies, idolatry, sodomy, adultery, making a false profession of faith. The prohibition of certain things simply in virtue of their description as such and such identifiable kinds of action, regardless of any further consequences, is certainly not the whole of the Hebrew Christian ethic, but it is a noteworthy feature of it. And then she goes on to say, and if every academic philosopher since Sidgwick has ignored it, then that's the more important thing to note about these philosophical views than whatever differences they have between them. She then says it is notable that none of these philosophers, these British moral philosophers from Sidgwick on, displays any consciousness that there is such an ethic, which he is contradicting. But it is pretty well taken for obvious amongst them all that a prohibition such as that on murder, just for being murder, does not operate in the face of some consequences. But of course, the strictness of the prohibition has it as the point that you are not to be tempted by fear or hope of the consequences. Now, one of the things that I'm curious to talk about in the Q&A is this phrase right here, that, or this last claim rather, that the point of having entire categories of action be strictly forbidden in the Abrahamic traditions of ethics, and again in Greek traditions as well, Aristotle makes a similar point, is that one is not to be so much as tempted to perform the relevant kinds of actions by even by what good consequences might come of them. Here is another way that Anscombe makes this point, or another place that Anscombe makes this point about temptation. Sidgwick explains the difference between old-fashioned utilitarianism and that consequentialism, as I name it. This was the spot in the text where she gives it the name, which marks him and every English academic moral philosopher since him. By it, the kind of consideration which formerly would have been regarded as a temptation, the kind of consideration urged upon men by wives and flattering friends, was given a status by moral philosophers in their theories. I'm also curious why you all think that Anscombe uses this way of describing temptation as a consideration urged upon men by wives and flattering friends. There's something tongue-in-cheek going on there, but I'm not quite sure that I entirely get it. So I would love help with that. But at any rate, she seems to be very, very concerned about the possibility of temptations towards category of actions that is a reason that certain categories are simply forbidden by most moral codes in the West up until the middle of the 19th century, that then disappears with the advent of consequentialism in the wake of the atheism of her contemporaries. That very bit of text that I just read to you, the next sentence is the sentence in which she makes the remark about consequentialism being unnecessarily shallow philosophy. She says it is a necessary feature of consequentialism that is a shallow philosophy, for there are always borderline cases in ethics. Okay, so I want to close. I've got a handful of slides still to go through, but our closing point is going to be to see if we can make sense of what she means in characterizing consequentialism as shallow, and what problems come about, or what problems can come about from the shallowness. I've got a contemporary example that I'm gonna end on, and then we'll open the floor to discussion. So here's a reminder of the things to note about consequentialism that make the various British moral philosophers of her day mostly the same. Consequentialism is by necessity a shallow philosophy. She thinks is the result that we'll arrive at once we realize these common features of consequentialism. So why is it shallow? And what's the problem with its shallowness? Okay, well, one thing that we've already talked about is that one function of moral philosophy is to offer guidance in confusing situations. I haven't put it quite that way yet. I put it earlier by saying that moral philosophy is meant to guide our actions. It's one thing we use it for. Another thing we use for is for evaluating actions after they've taken place. But this is one of the things that one would hope that studying ethics would equip one to do, is to make better decisions in the world about what to do. So we'll need that guidance when we confront confusing situations. And average, ordinary situations, we might not need any such guidance. In one way that she has focused our attention to in the quotes I just presented, the traditional ethics does this, is through simply prohibiting certain categories of action, saying of certain categories of action, adultery, idolatry, murder, bearing false witness, you just don't do it ever under any circumstances. So if we want to use that kind of framework to guide action, then what we do when we're deciding what to do in a tricky situation, one form of practical reasoning that we can engage in is say, is doing XYZ a forbidden action? Say, is dropping the bomb on Hiroshima murder? Or is illegally downloading something theft? We ask ourselves that question, and if the answer is yes, if we come to the conclusion that upon analyzing what it would mean to drop the bomb on Hiroshima, or what it would mean to illegally download, say, a book, that it falls under the category murder or theft, we're done asking ethical questions. If we get to oh, that would fall under the category of prohibited action, we stop there. We don't do the thing because it's prohibited. So these are just examples of like how we can use these frameworks for engaging in deliberation about action. But this kind of reasoning is senseless from a consequentialist perspective, precisely because there are no prohibited categories of action. We don't ask ourselves whether something that we're thinking about doing falls under a certain category: theft, murder, bearing false witness, treachery, whatever. That's not the kind of thing that we ask ourselves if we're trying to decide about what to do. And in fact, when we think about it, we realize that from the consequentialist perspective, there's no such thing as a moral dilemma. The only confusion that one can have about a situation is about how to properly perform the moral calculus, how to add up the plus and minuses, how to add up the costs and the benefits and see what the answer is. That's the only confusion that we could ever arrive at. If we're not confused about that, if we've done a good job of adding up the pluses and the minuses and performing our moral calculus, it spits out an answer like a moral calculator and tells us what to do. So that's a recipe for experiencing life in such a way that there's just never any moral confusion that comes up. The best the best is the wrong way to put it. The most one can have by way of being perplexed is being perplexed at solving a complicated math problem. The sorts of moral dilemmas that ethics historically has meant to be provide a way of dealing with just disappear from the consequentialist perspective. Now, you might think that that is a point in favor of consequentialism. It's making things simpler. It's eliminating the confusions that one arrives at when one approaches life through the lens of a Judaic Christian or Judaic moral ethic, a Christian moral ethic, or an Aristotelian ethic, which is the one that Anscombe advocates for her atheist colleagues. But Anscombe's response to that thought that like, oh, didn't we just make things a whole heck of a lot simpler by removing these categories of actions and just adding up the pluses and minuses and figuring out what to do that way? She's worried that like one thing that it will result then is that we will then create a world in which one will simply not even bother to ask, is Truman a murderer? Is what he did count as murder? That will lose the perspective for asking critical questions about the activities of those like Truman that under previous systems would have clearly been morally objectable, that we're like creating blinders for ourselves for being able to even ask questions like this because we're depriving ourselves of categories like murderer, idolater, someone who performs a treacherous action. A more recent example of how this can come up, not in the evaluative side of things, but on the action guiding side of things, can be found, I think, in one of the latest disasters that consequentialism can be seen as having produced, which is the collapse of the crypto exchange FTX as a result of the activities of its founder, Sam Bankman-Fried. So you all might have seen this in the news last November when the crypto exchange FTX collapsed. There was a flurry of articles that came out in the aftermath of its collapse, asking whether this philosophical view known as effective altruism was behind the collapse of FTX and the depositors of the crypto exchange losing all of their money. What's the connection here to Anscombe, consequentialism, et cetera? Well, effective altruism is just the latest variant of consequentialism to gain sort of have a sort of mass popular following in I would say in the West. Its major proponent is a guy named McCaskill, who teaches at Oxford and leads a nonprofit that seeks to take in donations and allocate them in an effectively altruistic way. Effective altruism is the term that is used for this brand of consequentialism. It seeks to be effective by trying to leverage time and money as effectively as possible. And it's maybe the thing that will demonstrate what distinguishes it most from earlier forms of consequentialism is that there is a branch of effective altruism known as long-termism. The title long-termism sounds to me like a chronic disease, but long-termists believe that if we're being consistent consequentialists, then what we should care about the most is human life in general. And so we shouldn't prejudice the value of present human life over the value of future human life. So long-termists tend to be concerned about things like climate change, thinking that we need to think about what's going to happen to people many generations down the road about the decisions that we happen to make now. But they also, once that ball is rolling, they think, well, if the world ends up being like way, way, way more populated in about 500 years worth of time than it is today, and we're just doing a moral calculus, trying to add up the pluses and minuses, what those people experience and feel as a whole, because there's so many more of them, vastly outweighs the pros and cons of what we happen to do in this lifetime. What our focus should be on is doing everything in our power to figure out how to make the lives of those people, because there's going to be so many more of them hundreds of years down the road, better off than they would be if we didn't make those decisions. And the way where someone like Sam Bankman-Fried comes into this is that this has been used as a justification by people like Fried and others, in particular in the investment in crypto community, as a rationale for getting extremely rich right now and then donating all of their money to various medical and technological causes that will pave the way to a brighter future for generations on down the road. So by all accounts, SBF thought that as he built his crypto empire and got, was like wildly, wildly rich, that he was being morally good. He was being a good consequentialist, a good effective altruist, a good long-termist, because he was going to make all this money and then donate it to causes that would help people live well in the future. So some of the details about what went wrong, real quickly. All you need to know for the purposes of this talk about what FTX was that it was an exchange for crypto derivatives. SBF used the depositors' money in FTX. In order to get on the exchange, you had to use what I think John would tell us is money, real money, the kind of money that is issued either as currency by states or bank money. You had to deposit some of that onto FTX in order to get the crypto tokens that would then go on to be used in order to buy and sell derivatives on the market. And what SBF did with that bank money and was take it and then move it over to his hedge fund, Alameda Research, in order to make increasingly risky bets, which he felt like he had to make in order to cover losses that were realized when interest rates went up. You don't need to know any of that story to know that he didn't tell his depositors that he had moved his money over to his hedge fund and then were using that money to make risky bets, which then came up short. When FTX crashed in November, for reasons that, again, we won't need to get into for this talk, the depositors who had put their money there thinking that their money was being used in order to participate in this crypto exchange found that they had no more money because Sam Bankman-Fried had spent it over in his hedge fund in order to make risky bets. For that, he is now in a great deal of trouble. So what's the role of consequentialism here in this tale of Sam Bankman-Fried? What would Anscombe have to say potentially if she were to rise from the grave, and then you teach her about crypto and then look at this situation with SBF. Well, SBF seems to have believed that all that mattered for his actions were the expected consequences of what he was doing. And moreover, he was, as people in effective altruism tend to be, very high on his ability to predict well, that he knew what the consequences of his action were going to be. This style of philosophy goes hand in hand with people who do not have a great deal of intellectual humility and think they know better than anyone what the consequences of their actions are going to be. They're better at predicting what's going to happen in the future than other folks. So Freed thought that he knew for sure that the way that he was handling other people's money was going to result in his companies making, again, $1 zillion. He also believed that he could predict with a reasonable degree of certainty that as he got to old age, he would in fact part with all of this money that he would make, as opposed to having a change of heart, keeping it all. He thought that he had all these beliefs about what he was doing, what was going to happen, and what the effects of all the money was going to be. And all those beliefs about the expected consequences justified what he was doing in the moment. And I think if Anscombe were to rise from the grave and see what would happen, she would say, this is exactly my point. This is why we have categories of action that are impermissible, because no one is wise enough to be able to see in the future in the way that SBF thought he could. And no one's character is strong enough once they have given themselves over to temptations, and say the temptation to make a ton of money, to stick with it through the end, to do what they've set out to do and believe that is good. We need categories of actions such as lying and stealing being just wrong in order to prevent these kinds of catastrophes from happening.